Just a teeny bit of dust on the cover. I took off a week because I was working really hard on this chapter I'm writing. I don't know why I was so single-minded about it, but I'm back. Don't remember at all what was happening, but it's on page 525. Of all the hundreds of public works that Robert Moses was building in New York City during the 1930s, the one whose creation most clearly manifested the same extraordinary capabilities he had displayed on Long Island was the project that arose from the first and longest held of his dreams, the dream of the great highway that went uptown along the water, and of the great park alongside that had made him exclaim to Francis Perkin in 1914, staring from the deck of a Hudson River ferry boat at the muddy wasteland below Riverside Drive, "Couldn't this waterfront be the most beautiful thing in the world?" All the qualities that made Robert Moses a genius of public works were needed for the realization of this dream. Its scope was all but unprecedented in urban America. The West Side Improvement, as he named it, included not only the completion of the long-stalled 5-mile elevated express highway from the southern tip of Manhattan Island to 72nd Street, but also the design and construction of the extension of that highway 6.5 miles north to the northern tip of Manhattan Island, the transformation of 6.5 miles of muddy wasteland into a park that would make beautiful the city's western waterfront, the throwing of a Henry Hudson Bridge across the Harlem River that separated Manhattan from the Bronx, the continuation of the highway through the Bronx to the city line and beyond that line to the Sawmill River Parkway, so that the city would have at last a true outlet to the north. And the problems in the way of its realization were unprecedented as well. At last, 20 years after he had dreamed the dream, he had the power in the city that was half of the elixir needed to transfer the dream into reality. But he still didn't have the other half of the elixir, money. Hi, Pearl. There must be birds out. The amount needed was staggering. The work below 72nd Street had been carried out under a 1927 agreement between New York City and the New York Central Railroad, which was anxious for an enlarged freight yard at 30th Street and longer covered train assembling tracks further uptown because of the introduction of diesel locomotives, which could pull longer trains than steam locomotives. Under the agreement, the city gave the railroad land for an enlarged yard and for depressed tracks leading to it. The railroad, in return, surrendered its permanent right-of-way through Riverside Park and down 11th Avenue. And the railroad and city, under an incredibly complicated arrangement, wow, that feels so, okay, I'm writing a book right now, and anytime that I write the incredibly complicated, it truly means that I spent several hours being like, what does this mean? So anyway, I'm trying to. That line gave me a lot of empathy for Robert Caro here. Okay, anyway, under this incredibly complicated arrangement, the city and the railroad were to share the cost of constructing a West Side elevated highway from the Battery north to 72nd Street. The southern border of Riverside Park, as well as the cost covering the railroad's tracks through the park and through its northerly extension, Fort Washington Park, which ran to 192nd Street. Asterisk. The public used the name Riverside Parks to refer to both parks, and so, for the sake of simplicity, will this book. Great. I can live with that. By 1929, the city, proceeding with the highway in typical Tammany fashion, down to its adornment with millions of dollars worth of granite, had spent $25 million as its share of the job. And the railroad had spent $84 million for a total of $109 million. And when the Depression brought both railroad and city to the brink of bankruptcy and forced the halt of work, the job was not nearly done. Out of 120 blocks in the park, for example, the tracks had been covered for only the first 7, between 72nd and 79th Streets. $20 million might be needed to complete the highway and track depressing operations below Riverside Park alone, and Moses's preliminary estimates of the rest of the work indicated that the amount of money needed to finish the whole West Side Improvement might as well equal the $109 million already spent. And the immensity of this amount was only part of the problem. From a political point of view, what seemed to make obtaining it almost impossible was the 1927 agreement, which provided that a substantial part of the cost of the improvement was to be borne by the New York Central. The city's taxpayers had been aroused by decades of questionable dealings between the railroad and the complaisant city officials, dealings such as the one that I have a cat in the way. Dealing such as the one that had given the railroad the permanent right-of-way through a city park and down a city avenue in the first place. I probably want to say hi to your fans. They obviously would view any attempts to give their money to relieve the railroad of its obligation as another giveaway. No sensible politician would dare to suggest such an arrangement. The railroad's share of the West Side Improvement was going to have to be paid by the railroad, or there wasn't going to be any improvement. But the railroad was in no position to pay, and obviously wasn't going to be for years to come. 109. Also, this is my Raytheon mug as a joke because I thought the art was funny. I'm not a Raytheon fan or anything, just so you know. Before you start rumors that Annie loves missiles or something. Okay, anyway. $109 million was a terrible obstacle to place between a man and his dream. Since the turn of the century, other men had been attempting to obtain just a small portion of that sum, enough to build a bridge over the Harlem River and short approach roads. No one but Moses had come up with a fully thought out plan for the reclamation of Riverside Park, and had never come close to obtaining funds for even those limited improvements. On 5 separate occasions since 1904, the city had drawn up plans for a Henry Hudson Bridge. And when Moses drove up to the Harlem, wow, no one ever calls it the Harlem anymore. That's actually very interesting. But the Bronx is always the Bronx. There was a huge edit war on Wikipedia of whether the title of the article should be Bronx or the Bronx, kind of like the big famous edit war of Beatles versus the Beatles as the title. Anyway, I'm circling this because I want to come back to this. Anyway, okay, so on 5 separate occasions since 1904, the city had drawn up plans for a Henry Hudson Bridge, and when Moses drove up to the Harlem in 1934, the only trace of the plans he could find was the 100-foot-high column without a statue on top of it, and a number of faded billboards, one, it seemed, for every city administration of those 30 years, proclaiming the imminent start of construction. Couple the amount needed with the fact that a substantial part of it had to be provided by a near-bankrupt railroad, and even to Moses's aides who had watched RM work fiscal magic before, the obstacle looked insurmountable. They watched RM set out to surmount it. Also, hello. Under one part of the 1927 agreement, the New York Central had agreed to pay the city $5 million, and the city had agreed that it would spend that money only on the West Side Improvement. Under another part of the agreement, the railroad had agreed to pay outright part of the cost of roofing its tracks in Riverside Park. $3,200,000 of the track roofing cost was still outstanding, which meant that the railroad owed the city a total of $8,200,000. If Moses could get this money from the railroad, he would have taken at least a first step toward the realization of his $109 million dream. But the railroad didn't have it. In order for him to get the money from the railroad would have to get it from somewhere else first. Since the Central's own sources of credit were exhausted, Moses would have to obtain the money for the railroad himself, and he would have to give the money to the railroad's hard-eyed directors under conditions that would force them to spend it not on such urgent obligations as weekly payrolls, which, for the railroad, desperately short on cash, was finding it increasingly difficult to meet, but on obligations that, in time of financial crisis, the directors might well consider eminently deferrable, the beautification of a city park. There were, Moses saw immediately, reasons for the railroad directors to want beautification. For one, they, as well as the city, wanted the tracks in Riverside Park covered. That was the only way the long diesel-pulled trains could be assembled without interference from weather. Wow, that's crazy that they had to cover. Trains can't work in the rain? I need some train head to give me info on this. Why would they need to cover the tracks just because it's diesel? For another, on part of its debt to the city, the $5 million part, the railroad was paying 6% interest compounded annually. The railroad had not been able to meet the interest payments since 1929, and they had therefore been added to the principal. By 1934, the principal, the amount on which the railroad was paying interest, was no longer $5 million, but $6,500,000. Its overall debt was therefore no longer $8,200,000, but $9,700,000. And its 1934 interest payment on the $6,500,000 would be $390,000 for that year alone. Since the Depression had forced the cost of money, interest rates, down to well below 6%, the railroad was paying the city much more for its money than it should have been. Okay, this is just one of those sections where we're getting a lot of details. Okay, now in the free moments of many days, Moses began to cover pages of yellow legal notepads with little clumps of figures. When aides looked over his shoulder, they saw that he was multiplying numbers together. The numbers being multiplied were millions of dollars. Those he was multiplying by were percentages. The aides realized that they were interest rates. And one day, the figures fit together into a pattern that enabled him to obtain from the New York Central Railroad not $9,700,000, but $13,500,000. Robbie, how are you going to do it? The key was obtaining new cash for the Central at an interest rate that would make it possible for the railroad to accept it. Use part of it to pay off the $6,500,000 debt to the city. Use another part of it to pay off its $3,002,000 debt to the city. Have enough left over to give the city an additional new contribution for the West Side Improvement. A contribution it was not required to make under the previous agreement, and still be paying an annual interest rate less than the $390,000 it was now being forced to pay. Such an arrangement would give the railroad the track covering it needed, while at the same time saving it money. I don't know how you guys are feeling, but I'm just like, let's just build this railroad. I'm struggling to care. Moses needed a source that not only would loan money to a private business in precarious financial condition, but would loan it money at a very low rate of interest. There was, he knew, such a source. It was the state of New York. At first, this source did not look like a promising one. The Depression had made the state's own financial positions shaky. Even if it were steady, Governor Lehman and the legislature would shy away from spending money to bail out a railroad whose shadowy hold over public officials was legendary. I want to know more about that. But Moses knew that there was one source of state money that had been lying untapped ever since the Depression began. The sizable balance in the $300 million grade crossing elimination fund that had been created in 1926. No one had ever thought of using the fund to finance the West Side Improvement. Moses did not think of it himself at first because grade crossings traditionally referred to the lifting of a highway over a railroad track at a single point. And the West Side Improvement, besides being as much a park as a highway project, consisted of building a highway beside or on top of a railroad track for 6.5 miles. But both a railroad track and a highway were involved in the West Side Improvement, and the best bill drafter in Albany found that there were provisions in the legislation established in the Grade Crossing Elimination Fund that would, by broad interpretation, allow use of the fund for at least part of the improvement. The interest rate on monies from the fund was, he realized, only 2%. 2% of $9,700,000 was only net $194,000 per year, almost $200,000 less than the interest the New York Central was now paying on its debt to the city. The railroad could accept far more than $9,700,000 from the state, give the balance to the city, and still be saving money. He suggested this course to the railroad and persuaded it to agree to accepting $13,500,000, an amount on which the annual interest would be $270,000, representing a savings to the railroad of $120,000 that year per year, at the same time it obtained its track covering. If we hear any more about the interest that the railroad is paying, I'm gonna die. Then, to reconcile Lehman and the legislature to the loan by making it apparent to the public that there was no giveaway, Moses conceived a complicated device which required the railroad to place all interest payments in escrow 6 months in advance, while making the loan what amounted to a tax lien against all the railroad's properties in the state. Property is worth many times the amount of the loan. On a yellow legal notepad, he drafted legislation authorizing the loan and told Jack Madigan to take it up to Albany. If the legislation became law, the city would be getting $13,500,000 in improvements at no cost to itself. And Robert Moses would see his longest held dream a long step closer to becoming reality. What is an AGM? I don't know what that is. I'm Googling it. Oh, an annual general meeting. Okay, yeah, I feel like I need a CPA with me on one side of me to to make me appreciate the details of this. Then there was the governor. Moses received word that Lehman didn't want to sign. The governor, he was informed, was leery about its legality and about the giveaway implications. And to make matters stickier, Lehman and Moses were in the midst of a bitter battle over another Moses maneuver. Since the bill was passed during the last 3 days of the session, it was a 30-day bill. The governor had to sign it within 30 days of the session's end, or the bill was dead. And on the 29th day after the session's end, Lehman still had not signed it. Moses sent me up to see him because he knew he liked me, Madigan recalls. I was in the Capitol at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the governor let me sit out in his outer office on my fanny from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5:10 in the afternoon. Twice I ran out and called Moses because of how worried I was. I told him, he's letting me sit. Moses said something like, stubborn bastard. Finally, I got in to see him. He jumped all over me. I told him how much the city was going to get out of this. He says, Moses will get all the credit for this. I said, thinking fast, Governor, you should be able to share the credit. He said, he's not the kind who likes to share much. I said, Governor, nobody in the world knows if you're going to veto this bill or not. His PR man was Joe Canavan, who was one of the very best. I said, have Canavan write up your own release and give it to the Sunday papers. I have glossies right here that you can use. I said, Governor, tomorrow's the last day. Okay, so the governor's PR man, Joe Canavan, there was a little asterisk. Joseph J. Canavan, former editor of The World. Okay, great. Thanks for that info. Madigan was offering to let Lehman, instead of Moses, announce that he would sign the bill and reveal the benefits it would give the city, thereby gaining identification with the project and basking in the praise that the newspapers would undoubtedly bestow on everybody connected with it. Madigan was reminding the governor that the story would undoubtedly get a good play because Saturdays are generally slow news days. He was even offering to let the governor distribute the glossy, ready-for-newspaper reproduction photographs of the improvements the $13,500,000 would buy. The governor said, that'd make Bob so goddamn mad. He smiled. But then he said, I need a memorandum from the comptroller, which is a written opinion which Lehman could use to justify his signing that the bill was constitutional. Bob had briefed Charlie Mullins in the comptroller's office about the bill because he knew Lehman trusted him. I said, Governor, Charlie Mullins is over there right now and he knows all about this. Lehman called over there and Mullins agreed that this bill was legal, so everything worked out all right. Of the approximately $109 million that had stood between Robert Moses' dream and reality, $13,500,000 had been acquired. Then it was, we really got all the info about how exactly it was acquired. There was $95,500,000 to go. Please, they need to just call that. What's his name? Call Hector, the little short guy, who just one phone call. He gave money for the highway. Okay. Anyway, the arrangement with the New York Central soon gave Moses $4 million more. As part of his plan to expand Riverside Park, he wanted to sink bulkheads out from the shoreline and fill the water behind them with rock and earth. Such fill was expensive, more than $2.50 per cubic foot. But Moses suddenly realized that the excavations that the Central would now be able to finish below 72nd Street would provide vast amounts of fill. Inquiring as to what was being done with it, he was told that it was simply being transported somewhere on Long Island and dumped there. He pointed out to railroad officials that if they let him send trucks to the excavations and haul it away and use it in Riverside Park, they would save the cost of transporting it. They agreed, and in this fashion, he obtained $1,500,000 of cubic yards. He obtained a bunch of cubic yards of fill worth $4 million. There was $91,500,000 to go. RM has this mind. He can read a piece of legislation and remember every darn thing in it, Sid Shapiro recalls. He seems to know the wording of every darn bill in Washington and in Albany that had ever been passed relating to public works. We were talking about the 79th Street boat basin, and he said, let's build a real boat basin. The facade of the marina decorated with stone gargoyles, and behind it a fountain with jets of water arching from the mouths of brass turtles. Have you ever heard of a boat basin with gargoyles? Well, I hadn't either. But he remembered some obscure federal statute that had been passed, years before, to encourage the use of artwork on public works. If we put on gargoyles, Moses said, not only would the boat basin be beautified, but the money from the fund could be used to build it. One day, RM said, what happened to some fund I remember that was being set up by a private philanthropist so that it could be used to decorate a public project with ornamental friezes? Is there any money left in that? Well, we looked it up, and there was. So RM said, let's have a frieze. We told our boat basin guy about this. I love that they just have a boat basin guy. Call up the boat basin guy. They told him about it. These guys are usually hard-boiled fellows to think in terms of jetties, groins, sheet metal, riprap. Well, you tell one of them gargoyles and friezes, he almost falls off his designer's stool. But the two funds contained a total of almost $100,000 for which the boat basin phase of Robert Moses' dream would be eligible. And there was $91,400,000 to go. The 79th Street boat basin was, of course, the magnificent structure Moses had envisioned for Riverside Park years before, a combination marina, riverside restaurant, and pedestrian promenade. In the plans that Moses finally approved, throwing his arms around Chief Architectural Engineer Clinton Lloyd in joy, the top level was a large traffic cone that allowed cars coming from the city's interior access to the great highway along the water. The center of the circle was hollow. The center of the traffic circle, sorry. The center of the traffic circle was hollow. Down inside it, on the middle level, was a cool, shadowy interior courtyard. The center of the courtyard was the fountain, its murmur just loud enough to drown out the noise of cars and city above it. Around the fountain was a low marble bench for passers-by to sit on. On the river side of the courtyard were three high, wide arches. Beyond them was a broad outer terrace overlooking the marina below it and the river beyond, designed to hold both the gaily canopied tables of the riverside restaurant and the broad, tree-shaded pedestrian promenade. And the bottom level of the structure, completely concealed inside it and reached by access roads circling down around its outside from the traffic circle above, was a 200-car garage for the owners of boats docked in the marina. The structure did not resemble a railroad grade crossing elimination, but by coincidence, Harold Ickes, the PWA administrator. Oh, wait, we remember Ickes because we had to read his diary for so long, right? Do you guys remember that? I certainly do. And then I looked him up, and it turns out that he had a very fascinating and tragic life. But the section of his diary that we read was so boring. Anyway, Harold Ickes, perturbed that PWA expenditures were not generating enough immediate employment, had recently promised quick approval for projects for which plans were ready. And when a reporter had asked what kind of projects the administration had in mind, Ickes said he thought that elimination of highway grade crossings over railroad tracks offered one means that could be undertaken immediately. There were no highways over the tracks around 79th Street to be eliminated, but there were tracks to be covered and roads to be built, and Ickes sounded anxious for plans. Working day and night, Lloyd and a team of engineers from Madigan's consulting firm completed them in a week, and Madigan headed down to Washington with the blueprints under his arm. The first thing that PWA officials there noticed when they unrolled them was their new, very prominently displayed title, 79th Street Grade Elimination Structure. If the officials noticed that it didn't resemble any other grade crossing elimination structure ever built, they didn't mention the fact. The only demurrer coming from one narrow-minded bureaucrat who commented that the brass turtles and comfort stations were a little too much to be tacked on to a grade crossing, and slashed off the $154,000 cost of those items. And Madigan returned with the promise that the PWA would chip in the $1,766,000 that the materials for the rest of the structure would cost. Then Moses told LaGuardia that for just $154,000 more, the city could have not just a boat basin, but a beautiful boat basin, and the mayor scrounged up that money. Yeah, please, we need some brass turtles. Then Moses told the CWA that the materials for the project were paid for, and he could put men to work immediately. And the CWA contributed more than $3 million for wages on the work of the boat basin, bringing the total money raised for the structure to more than $5 million. And there was $86,400,000 to go. This is so... I realize what he's doing, like we're seeing how he's creating money from nothing in the middle of the Depression. But wow, this is just a lot. Oh, what was tragic about Ickes' life? Okay, Harold Ickes, during the time we knew him, he was just like this guy that was working for President Roosevelt, giving away money for the PWA. But then after he becomes irrelevant to Robert Moses, his wife and son like tragically died, and he ended up working. He worked in the White House for like decades and decades. He saw a bunch of administrations. He was probably really interesting later on, but in our purposes and in this book, I found him to be very dry and not exciting. And also, his diary was, I'm pretty sure his diary, he published it, and it was 3,000 pages, which is three times as big as this book, which is already so big. And you don't write a diary that's so polished and so long unless like it's like that's not really how people treat it, like a diary. He clearly wanted to publish it the whole time. Anyway, whatever. Moving on, let's see how he's going to get these $86 million. Is he going to do it? RM never seemed to run out of ideas, Shapiro would recall. He said to us, "We'll build the highway part of the way along the New York Central tracks, so we'll be eligible for state aid to railroads." Because there were boat basins along a river involved, he found clauses in the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act under which we could get the money. There was federal highway money available, of course, so he said, "We'll tie it in with the George Washington Bridge, so it'll be an interstate highway and we can get funds that way." Because he had to demolish some buildings, quote, "You'd have to tear down a few buildings at 72nd Street and bring the highway around a curve," he had told Francis Perkins 20 years before, and that was just how it worked out. He even found a way we were eligible for federal housing funds. On that one project, we had housing, interstate highway, rivers and harbors, and railroads. Moses obtained a total of more than $12 million from such sources, and there was $74 million to go. Still, $74 million to go. And much of this money was needed for materials and equipment, which could be obtained in no other way than by putting up hard cash that Moses didn't have. He had to economize, and he knew where to do it. The cost of the Riverside Park he had envisioned as a young man, a park in which the ugly railroad tracks were covered with lush lawns and greens, a park crammed lavishly with marinas and waterfront promenades and tennis courts and playgrounds, was running about $8 million per mile. He continued to develop the park lavishly for the first 2 of its 6.7 miles, the 2 miles bordered by a neighborhood inhabited by the upper and comfortable middle classes he liked to develop parks for. But for the rest of its length, from about 110th Street, where the neighborhood was becoming perceptibly poorer, he scrimped, putting in few improvements and doing those in a cheap slapdash style. 125th Street was the southern border of Black Harlem. Already in 1934, black faces were appearing on many of the side streets behind Riverside Drive. From 125th Street North, Robert Moses put almost no improvements into Riverside Park, designing its northern 3.3 miles with one aim in mind: to do them as cheaply as possible. The aim was accomplished. The development of the southern 2 miles of Riverside Park, the stretch south of 110th Street, cost $16,300,000, or about $8 million per mile. The development of the northern 4.7 miles of Riverside Park cost $7,900,000 total, or about $1,700,000 per mile, and thus saved Moses about $6,300,000 per mile, or a total of $29 million less than it would have cost if he had built it to the same standards as the southern section. And there was $45 million to go. I think I might just, should I stop there, or should I, let's see if he's going to get the money. Okay, no, it looks like it's going to take, there's a lot more pages of him getting money, I think. This chapter is really long. I feel like I'm really being tested. Sorry I took off an entire week. Wait, this chapter, I think, maybe there's just, I don't know if this chapter is ever going to end. Okay, I think the structure is just different now. Like, I think that in this section, maybe he just doesn't do chapters. Oh, wait, no, he does. Okay, so the next chapter is on page 576, and currently we're on page 533. So only 40 more pages of this chapter. This is really testing me, but I'm going to stay strong. Anyway, thanks for joining, and sorry that I took off a week, but I'm back now. See you later.